Hi, and welcome to the AP Biology Lab 9 Transpiration podcast. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about the Transpiration Lab. But first, let's talk a little bit about transpiration. I love this picture right here because it shows, they're called popcorn clouds, and they're actually formed by transpiration. So where are we? This is in South America, so this is Brazil, and this is the Amazon River right here flowing into the Atlantic. But what you can see are these little clouds all the way through here, and what's producing those is transpiration from the trees. So transpiration is simply water that's evaporating off the leaves. And you can see where the Amazon flows, we don't have those clouds. So it's clearly caused by transpiration. And so a way to think about transpiration is it's simply evaporation off of the leaf. And so where does that evaporation occur? The water will actually evaporate out the stomata. And so this is a cross-section of a leaf. These right here would be the spongy mesophyll on the bottom. And you can see that the water is actually leaving there. And it moves through some structures called guard cells. And so those guard cells can either open up or they can close. And that regulates the amount of water that you're actually losing due to transpiration. Sometimes it's a bunch. What are some terms that are important before we actually get to the lab setup? One is osmosis. In other words, why is the water actually flowing into the root? Well, the root has more solutes in it than the surroundings do. And so the water is moving from an area of high water concentration to low water concentration. Or a better way to think of that is the water is moving towards an area of low water potential. So water potential measures how much water actually is there. And so since there's less water here, it's going to flow into that area. Now sometimes in the morning you'll see things like this. This is called eutation, and that's root pressure that's actually pushing it up. So as that water flows into the root of the plant, it actually puts pressure on that whole column of water all the way up. And so that's actually forcing water out of the stomata. And that actually makes up some of what we normally think of as dew. But most of the driving force, I don't know if you can see that in this picture, it comes from the sun. And so the sun is evaporating the water from the surface, and then there's this thin connected tube that goes all the way down to the roots in the xylem of the plant. So those are some important terms. Now, the lab setup of this is kind of finicky, but essentially what you have, this is about as simple as it gets, is you have a tube, and that tube has water in it, and that water is continuous with a leaf that you just ram into the tube. It has a pipette on one side, so you can actually make some measurements on that side, and then we just measure it over time. And so what's going to happen? Well, as water evaporates off the surface of the leaf, it's going to be connected to water all the way down through the tube, and so the level in this tube is going to drop, and we can measure that and thereby measure the rate of transpiration. Now we've got a few different experimental groups. We've got a bag covering the leaf with mist inside it, a fan blowing on it, and then light shining on it. And so you should understand what's going to happen to the transpiration rate with all of these things. Another thing you can do is you can actually trace the leaf out, figure out the surface area of the leaf, and then we can figure out the transpiration rate for a given unit. So what results do we get? When we run this at our school, we can organize it this way. So we put the minutes on one column, and so that's going to be our independent variable in this case. And then we're going to put our different treatments as graphed on a graph that looks something like this. And so the nice thing about this is that it looks like a linear relationship, and so that means that there is a constant change in the amount of water that's inside the tube. And so that means there's a constant rate of transpiration. Now, if you ever put anything graphed over time, remember the slope of that is going to give you the rate of transpiration. And so if we look at the milliliters that are being consumed every minute, then we can figure out that just by looking at the slope of the line. Okay. Now, what's the conclusion? In other words, what should you draw from this lab? Well, you should have an understanding on how these four variables affect the rate of transpiration. Now, the reason it affects the rate of transpiration is not always the same. So let's go through this. So first of all, let's start with temperature. What happens as we increase the temperature around the leaf that's transpiring? Well, that's going to speed up the water. It's going to give it more kinetic energy, and so it's more likely to actually move from being a liquid to a gas. That's going to increase evaporation rate, and so there's a direct relationship between temperature. In other words, as temperature increases, the rate of transpiration is going to increase as well. Let's look at humidity next. What happens with humidity? Well, if you put that bag around it and mist some spray in there or some water in, what you're really doing is increasing the water potential inside the bag. In other words, there's more water there, and so it's less likely for that water to evaporate, and so that's going to be an indirect relationship. In other words, as the humidity goes up, then the transpiration rate is going to go down. Let's look at the next one, air movement. Let's say there's wind blowing over the surface of the leaf, just like wind blowing over the surface of your head when it's sweaty. It's going to remove that water and get rid of it, so more water can evaporate in its place. And so what's that going to do? Well, there's a direct relationship. The more wind we have, the more transpiration we're actually going to get. And then lastly, light intensity. That's going to increase the temperature within the leaf, so it's also going to increase the kinetic energy of the water. It's more likely to eventually evaporate. And so this is a pretty easy lab, and what you should think of, this is how I describe it in class, is that imagine a towel that's really, really wet, and it's just laying on a table. Anything that dries that towel out faster is going, like temperature increase or increased amount of light or wind blowing on it, is also going to increase the rate of transpiration. So I hope that's helpful.